Well, good afternoon. I got to say, it's always exciting to build a car while you're driving down the road in the car. And today's talk is going to have a little bit of that to it. I actually put the final version of this talk together last night in the wee hours while I was following the developments in the state legislature. As most of you might, might or might not know, the state did pass a budget at about 5:30 this morning. And it is, the good news, it is the earliest budget passage of any budget, because this budget is not just for the current fiscal year. It's actually for next fiscal year as well. So remember last September when we passed our state budget for this fiscal year, 3 months into the fiscal year, we actually passed this one 5 months before. That's the good news. We'll get into the bad news in a second. You might wonder why I still call this Deciphering California's Budget Crisis, given that, of course, the legislature solved it this morning. We're going to see why I think that may not be the case in a few seconds. But for our talk today, I had sort of 4 questions that I really wanted us to get to. First is, do we have a crisis? What is the crisis that we're facing? The second, how did we get here? The third being, what are we doing about it now? And we'll talk about the proposal that was approved. And then the fourth, what should we do or have done? Now, the really big challenge in all of this is every time an opportunity comes to revamp California's budgetary system, to revamp our public finance system, the state bails us out of the problem. These crises, these moments of challenge when our budget doesn't add up, are precipitated by a whole bunch of choices that we make in the years between the points where the economy turns around. And we never deal with the fundamental problems, in part because the California economy is very dynamic, and just about the time we get to the point where we have to deal with the problem, the economy takes off, and all of a sudden it's no longer a problem. This time around, we had another intervention. President Obama gave California a whole bunch of cash. And so the only reason why the legislature signed a budget this morning is largely fueled by the fact that nobody really believes that all the cuts are going to happen the way that the budget claims that they will. So let's talk about our crisis. How did we get in this crisis? The first aspect of our crisis is to note this is our history of spending and revenues and spending over the last 10 years or so. Interesting thing you'll note, in this period here, spending exceeds revenues. How did we solve that? You might remember back to 2004, we approved $15 billion in debt. We called it the Economic Recovery Fund. Governor Davis was recalled at this point. Governor Schwarzenegger came into office. He got the bonds approved. We spent $12 billion of them here and $3 billion of them here just last year. In fact, a year ago, the state was having the same conversation. How do we fix our budget situation? Their solution, borrow the other $3 billion they hadn't already borrowed from the 2004 initiative. Today, what we see happening is we had a budget that we had proposed at about $103 billion. Now, to give you a sense of scale, our deficit is larger than I think all but 10 states' budgets combined. Forget their deficits, their budgets. Okay, we are huge. Okay, so this is what we proposed right here, this red line. This is the revenues we expected. We had a little bit of extra cash sitting in the bank going into that fiscal year. We thought we'd be okay. This is where spending is, but this is the big problem. Revenues, as we know, October, November were not good months for the U.S. economy. California's budget is heavily dependent on wealthy Californians. It's a very progressive tax system. The top 5 to 10% pay 80 to 90% of all the tax revenue in income taxes in the state. When they don't do well, and when the stock market and the housing markets don't do well, the state's revenue stream collapses. You add on to that the state's dependence on property taxes in a time when property values are falling through the floor, and we've had a huge hiccup in revenues. Next year, we see an expectation that to maintain services as they are now, we'll have to grow expenditures by about $8 billion. That was the situation. When you add up all these numbers, the $14 billion shortfall from this year, and it's actually closer to $15 billion, about $1 billion of that is overspending. We're spending $104 billion instead of $103 billion. But on the revenue side, we're about $14.5 billion short in revenues. Next year, we expect about a $25 billion shortfall. You add the two things together, you end up with the magic $40 billion number that they had to reconcile. Now, how did we get here? There's 2 important threads to this crisis that have been mixed together in the media, and it's important for us to understand the difference. there's a cash flow problem which California has. This was the one that precipitated a lot of the taxpayer angst. We're not going to get our tax refunds if we file early. The County of Los Angeles is not going to get the payments it needs for medical services. The state of California is obligated to make certain payments. We have to make our payments to education. We have to make our payments to our bondholders. And so those are our first priorities. So the state controller imposed a bunch of cash flow controls to deal with that. If you think of it in your own household context, it's like, okay, I'm between jobs. I have to eat food this week, so I'm going to put the grocery bill on my credit card. But then when I get paid next week, I'll pay off the credit card. That's the idea of the cash flow crisis. The second issue, though, is this generic, okay, on an ongoing basis, I'm spending more than I earn. How do I deal with that relationship? And so in the case of the cash flow, you can see here, this is where the state controller said we're going to delay payments of all those things that I just talked about for 30 days. And in a month, guess what happens? If 0 here is the line where we're supposed to have enough cash on hand, we don't have enough cash on hand. That has been alleviated in large part by today's agreement, although it hasn't gone away. We're still tight on money for a couple months. The other thing that happens is that come April, we tend to get our income tax payments. If you think about it, most people who owe taxes have to make April payments. So we get a big surge in cash in April. In this model, they didn't see that as balancing the difference, but of this $2 billion shortfall here, $2.5 billion, if you think about deferred tax payments, the state expected to refund about $2 billion during that period. So just by holding off the taxpayer refunds, we dealt with the cash flow problem. The cash flow problem, if it had continued, and again, this was operating the car. I actually got up at 7:30 this morning to try and find a copy of the legislation, which nobody has yet, to see what they actually passed. If it had happened, it would have looked a lot like last summer. You had supplemental security checks being delayed. You had in-home support services, the folks who help seniors who can't do their housekeeping and things like that come in and help. You'd see those payments. You'd see vendors. The governor had threatened to suspend construction on 374 projects starting today, if the budget didn't pass by today. And you saw it would have looked a lot like last summer. However, the budget crisis is a much longer term problem. Now, you got to understand, largely this is the same legislature that couldn't do the job last summer. There's been a little bit of turnover, but it's pretty much the same membership. They still need bipartisan support. The electoral process, because of the way the primaries are structured in California, when they redrew the districts after the 2000 census, they created Democrat-safe districts and Republican-safe districts, which means the primary is the entire election. And in that kind of a system, what happens is the candidates that appeal to the core party base, the ones who show up during the primaries, are the ones who get elected. And they tend to be a little more partisan than the kind of candidates you would get in a system that has a later timeline. And so one of the challenges that we have is that the folks who are there deeply believe in what they believe in. So the Democrats deeply believe in government provision of services, deeply believe in protecting the most vulnerable Californians. The Republicans deeply believe in protecting the economy and protecting taxpayers and in having a limited role for government. These folks believe these things. They're not just political positions that these guys woke up this morning and said, this would be in my interest. I mean, this is why they were elected. This is why the constituencies that put them in office put them there. So the partisan divide is seriously magnified by the primary process and by the redistricting that happened after the last census. Now the good news is we changed all of this in the last election, and that in 2011 or so we're going to redraw the boundaries, and by the 2012 elections some of these issues might mitigate themselves. So if we can hang on till then, perhaps there's hope just in the redistricting process. As you can see, the Republicans didn't want taxes, the Democrats didn't want to cut expenses. The challenge before us is that this wasn't created just by that cash flow situation. We all knew going into this year's budget that there were $2 billion in expenditures that we didn't pay last year that we had to pay for this year. The way we do that in government finance is we say we're going to delay the payment. So a $2 billion payment that was supposed to go to the schools in June, we delayed until July. It's only a 2-week delay for the school districts, but for the budgetary process, now that's next year's budget, and we don't have to worry about it this year. We just decreased school spending by $2 billion. So we used all those tricks to get us to the 2008-9 budget that we saw, and then the revenues fell out of the floor. But even then, before that, we understood that our system was not supporting itself.